Hello and welcome back to Arts of Hermes. This is part 2 of our video on Surrealism and esotericism, and we're just going to pick up right where we left off. So if you've not yet seen part 1, I definitely recommend that you check that out first, and you can find a link to that in the description below. So here in part 2, I'd like to look more directly at the links between Surrealism and esotericism. Now that we've got some, I hope, foundation for thinking about Surrealism and its goals and its sort of philosophies and some of the basic sort of practices and ideas and its cultural, social, political sort of orientation. Within that context, drawing lines of relationship to various esoteric traditions and practices and schools of thought and imagery and so on. And then probably more like in part 3, because I do think we're going to need to go into a part 3 here, we can try to connect some of these pieces back up and see a more unified and richer picture of the entire movement and its practices, and I hope also suggest why interest in Surrealism and the study of its works and ideas might be valuable to contemporary Hermetic or other Western esoteric practitioners today, and how it might enrich their understanding of their practice and maybe suggest avenues of further research and practice. All right, so as a way into this, I wanted to start off by looking at the Surrealist practice of what they usually refer to as automatism. Automatism, especially as the movement developed, it became a fairly broad term that encompassed a number of different ideas and practices, or even more just a kind of like orientation towards creativity and the creative process. But early on, it has a fairly specific meaning, which is primarily the act of automatic writing, which is essentially, at least in its simplest form, exactly what it sounds like. The person conducting the exercise simply places pen on paper and writes in a way that is not directed by the conscious mind. Which is actually a lot more difficult to do than it sounds. It ends up being, and especially to produce anything of any kind of interest or that will actually surprise the person doing it. When I first started experimenting with it, years ago, it was really easy just to produce just sort of these kind of like either sing-songy kind of like nonsense, just like little bits of like common everyday phrases that would kind of like loop and repeat and were incredibly boring. And it actually takes quite a while to figure out how to get into just the right sort of state to be able to produce anything of any kind of interest. So it was definitely a practice and something that was developed and deepened over time. In addition to practicing automatic writing, which was the source of a lot of early like surrealist poetic and literary works, they also in their group meetings practiced something like a form of seance where, without any belief in that they were actually doing anything. They were actually, contacting any sort of discarnate beings or anything like that. Their assumption, or at least starting assumption, I think was always that they were simply opening up the contents of their own unconscious minds. But one of the members of the group, and there were a few in particular who were quite good at doing this, would go into a trance or would be hypnotized by another member of the group, and then would answer questions and engage in various dialogues or describe kind of visions and dreamlike scenarios, or spontaneously create like poetry or various narratives. That was an important group practice, but I think for the things that were actually published and released and became their creative output, it was the practice of automatic writing that was more central. And I think one of the main things that makes their practice of automatic writing so interesting, as I was just sort of pointing to a moment ago, that they always remained sort of suspended between two different approaches, or two different they drew on two different schools or traditions for the practice of automatic writing. Their main orientation was in a psychoanalytic, understanding of this, which is I tried to represent these two schools of thought by two of the cards from the playing card deck that we mentioned in part one. So we see on the right that is Freud as the magus of black stars or the magus of dreams, and so the Freudian practice of not necessarily automatic writing, but the idea of like free association, or even just the idea that the patient, in the analytic session is sort of laying on the couch without looking at the analyst and just is talking openly and freely and saying whatever it is that comes into their mind, and then the analyst reads what they're saying for the for the traces of the unconscious in that relatively free, undirected sort of mode. So that was always, I think, their main orientation was towards a kind of psychoanalytic understanding of what was happening in these various mediumistic or automatic processes. But there was always the awareness of and I think the opening to the possibility of something closer to the spiritualist tradition, which represented here by the another one of the cards, the Siren of Locks, the Siren of Knowledge, Hélène Smith, who I think I mentioned in part one, who is an important French spiritualist medium, who I think one of the things that was particularly enchanting about her was that she apparently was receiving communications from a civilization that she believed was on Mars, and received even like the sort of Martian alphabet and elements of the Martian language. Which, obviously the Surrealists didn't take literally, but they nevertheless found, obviously, an intriguing and enchanting practice. And the output, I think, that she came out with was, deeply interesting to them. So I think this sort of contradiction that we have between these two understandings of what's happening in automatic writing, that it's simply the opening up to the unconscious, or the idea that it's actually opening up to a non-human or forces or something beyond the individual person, including beyond their own individual unconscious, they're always sort of hesitating between those things. As I said, generally tending towards a more materialistic, psychological or psychoanalytic understanding, but there's always some tension there, and I think that tension, we see it all throughout the Surrealist relationship with esotericism and various esoteric or magical practices. There's always that sort of hesitation and uncertainty, and I think that's something that they really delight in and often play with, and we'll see some examples of them where you're really, I think they're intentionally playing in that sort of liminal space between what is what's simply a kind of playful engagement with these ideas, and what is genuine sort of esoteric practice. And I think in a lot of cases the boundary or that distinction becomes not particularly meaningful, which is a really interesting and I think magical and creative place to be in itself, is that sort of in between liminal state, which I think they became very good at cultivating and working within. All right, so just as an example of just to give a kind of flavor of automatic writing, I chose just a passage that I like from one of Andre Breton's text, Soluble Fish, which was based on automatic writings that he was doing. It's maybe worth noting that they never really published pure automatic writing. They were always edited or put together, or composed, and there was certainly selection. I mean, of the automatic writings that that any one of them produced, only a very small percentage of them ever made their way into finished works. So there was never any kind of preciousness about the products of that process. I think they were always seen as those practices were always ways of generating content and imagery that could then be transformed and edited and sort of pieced together and sequenced in different ways after the generation of the raw material. All right, yeah. So this is just a passage from Soluble Fish, and I'll just read it. Then she delightedly bit into the astonishing white stratifications that remained at her disposal, that is to say, the sticks of chalk, and these wrote the words love on the slate of her mouth. She thus ate a veritable little chateau of chalk, built in a patient and insane style, after which she threw a mouse-colored mantle over her shoulders, and with 2 mouse-skins as shoes, she descended the stairway of freedom which led to the illusion of the jamais vu. The guards let her pass. They were green plants kept at the edge of the water by a feverish card game. She thus reached the stock exchange, which gave not the slightest sign of life after butterflies took a notion to proceed with a capital execution there. I still see them all lined up when I close my eyes. The young girl sat down on the 5th step, and there called upon the horny powers to appear to her and subject her to the savage roots of the place. Since that day, she goes below the famous stairway every afternoon, an underground rumor putting the trumpet of ruin to her lips at certain fixed hours. So I think that gives us some sort of taste of the types of materials that were produced here, especially in the prose sort of mode. And we can see, I think, at least at times there, you can almost see the link, the free association, how one image suggests another, or we get these sort of partial metaphors that then sort of become literal in the next line. And I think it is definitely reminiscent of the dream state and the way that that state. I'm sure that's all familiar to us from dreaming. And there's some really, I think there's some good imagery in this passage too, especially this image of the butterflies proceeding with a capital execution at the stock exchange. I think is a really great image, and especially this idea that those butterflies are sort of burned into the into the speaker's mind, eyes there, that he still sees them when he closes his eyes. I think that's a great image. All right, so pretty early on, from the practice of automatic writing and those more sort of mediumistic seance-like sessions that they were practicing, the visual artists who were involved in the movement began developing ways of taking those techniques and adapting them to the visual arts. And so drawing was a lot, because of the speed and rapidity of drawing, it was a lot easier to figure that out. So here we have an example of one of the really early masters of automatic drawing, was Andre Masson, who's a really tremendous surrealist artist. And we'll actually see a later painting from him towards the end of this video, probably in part 3. Masson is a fantastic surrealist artist, and I think the Surrealists had the idea that through automatism and various automatic techniques, that they would be able to realize a sort of aspiration from the Comte de Lautréamont, actually, that poetry should be made by all, or that art should be made by all, and really wanting to develop ways for essentially, I think that was part of their sort of utopian vision of a transformed society, is that everyone becomes an artist, and everyone has access to their own inner unconscious creative powers. But the way it at least turned out in practice is that some were a lot better at these things than others. Like with the automatic writing, the quality of the automatic writing that was produced by a lot of them was directly related to just how good of writers the individuals engaged in the practice were. And the same thing is true of automatic drawing. And then just one more example of automatic drawing. This is from an artist of a younger generation. This is the German artist Unike Zern, who I think is mostly known today, when she's known at all, as a writer. She wrote several novellas and some other shorter pieces of literature, but she was also one of the really great masters of automatic drawing. I find her automatic drawings really compelling. There's a kind of hypnotic sort of quality to her use of pattern and line and sort of repeating images. Like here we see in a lot of her drawings these kind of repeating and layered faces and eyes, along with the sort of patternings and textures that we get in her drawings that I find really compelling. All right, so here we've got a text. This is from an essay by André Breton, written in, I believe it was 1953. 1953, where he's sort of reflecting here on some of the development of their practice of automatism and the fact that the practice of automatic writing didn't remain that important that they fairly rapidly moved on to other sorts of practices, and so he's reflecting on that here. And he also, as we'll see, makes a few linkages to or appeals to esoteric concepts. Just a word about Breton's style. There's something very, oblique, I suppose, about Breton's style in many cases. I often find that I have to sort of reread his writing more than once. I'm sort of like getting to the end of a paragraph and then just having to start right back over at the beginning end to really figure out what he's saying. Sometimes that's, there's a lot of depth there, but it can also just be quite frustrating to read him at times. So if this doesn't all totally make sense on a first reading, you might want to stop and reread it, or you could just let it kind of wash over you and get the the main sort of points or the feeling of what he's saying. So anyways, I'll just read it. Well, I may sort of stop along the way and make a few comments. All right, he writes, "It is no longer a question of making the free association of ideas serve for the elaboration of a literary work that tends to outdo preceding works by its daring, but at the same time as a work whose recourse to polyphonic, polysemantic, and other inspirations presupposes a constant return to the arbitrary. The whole point for Surrealism was to convince ourselves that we had got our hands on the prime matter, in the alchemical sense, of language." So prime matter, in the alchemical sense, at least within this context, is a reference to something that was believed in a lot of alchemical theories, which actually draws originally on some Aristotelian theories of matter, that there's something like matter in itself that does not contain any particular qualities, or is not maybe differentiated into a specific form of matter, but is a kind of almost like infinitely protean sort of substance that could become any material object. And so the alchemists often sought to, or especially I think this is especially true in the medieval period, often sought to reduce various substances, attempted to reduce various substances back into what they believed was this kind of substance of the prime matter, because they would then have something that could then be turned into gold or the healing elixir or whatever else. But here he's saying that, and I think as the paragraph goes on, we'll get more of a sense of what he means by the prime matter of language. But I think it's interesting to think that, at least at this point in time, he's understanding the whole process of automatic writing, not so much as just a method for literary production, but actually as a sort of alchemical operation to try to to get to this kind of primal substance of language itself, and then they've moved into other areas of creation with that thing after having completed this alchemical operation on language. Which resonates a bit with some of the things we said about Breton's ideas about language and the unconscious in the first part, that I think are really interesting and suggestive, and I think are really important actually for the as I believe I mentioned there, for the esoteric tradition and the deep and really long-standing connections between magic and language, and what that says about the nature of sort of human reality and even the the cosmos. All right, anyways, he will continue on here. He writes, "After that, we knew where to get it, and it goes without saying that we had no interest in reproducing it to the point of satiety. This is said for the benefit of those who are surprised that among us the practice of automatic writing was abandoned so quickly. It has often been said heretofore that our coming face to face with the products of this writing focused the projector on the region where desire arises unconstrained, a region which is also that where myths take wing. Not enough attention has been paid to the meaning and scope of the operation, which tended to bring language back to true life. In other words, rather than go back from the thing signified to the sign that lives on after it, which, moreover, would prove to be impossible, it is better to go back in one leap to the birth of that which signifies." So again, I think we can hear him developing this idea of prime matter about going back to the birth of that which signifies, rather than getting lost in the the signifier or the sign, but in that which that which comes to signify, or that which allows the process of signification to occur. And once they had gotten contact with that and were able to make contact with it, the practice of automatic writing was no longer needed. All right, I'll just read the last paragraph here. He writes, "The spirit that makes such an operation possible and even conceivable is none other than that which has always moved occult philosophy. According to this spirit, from the fact that expression is at the origin of everything, it follows that, quote, the name must germinate, so to speak, or otherwise it is false," unquote. I'm not actually sure what it is that he's quoting there, but that might be something that would be interesting to look into. He continues, "The principal contribution of surrealism in poetry, as in the plastic arts, is to have so exalted this germination that everything other than it seems laughable." So, linking the surrealist practice and this practice in particular, directly to occult philosophy, as he just did to alchemy in the previous paragraph. And also just really emphasizing his understanding of how important these results have been for poetry and the plastic arts. All right, let's just keep moving on here. So as the surrealist understanding of automatism developed, one thing that really opened up, and that I think especially as they practiced automatic writing, and in some of they had some pretty strange and remarkable results in some of their kind of seance like sessions, and as they continued to study esoteric works and the magical and occult traditions, they became increasingly interested in chance and the operations of chance and its connection to divination. Andre Breton, in a lot of his Breton writes a whole series of sort of autobiographical literary works. I think Nadja is probably the most famous of these. I think the one where he deals with chance most directly is the Communicating Vessels. But we see the same the same interest in other writings of his, Mad Love or Arcane 17. This is a sort of ongoing preoccupation of Breton, and we've seen a lot of other surrealists as well. So here we have a bit of a quotation that we already saw back in part one from Pierre Mabie from his essay, The Marvelous. And so I just wanted to return to that quote and then think about it in relation to this concept of the surrealist concept of objective chance. So Mabie had written, and it is also the conjunction of desire, it being the marvelous. The marvelous is also the conjunction of desire and external reality, the disturbing instant when we are in tune with Earth itself, when individual and planet agree. And so this idea of the conjunction of desire and external reality will be the sort of, there's not that much interest in having a really specific definition of objective chance, but this idea of the conjunction of desire and external reality, when an inner desire seems connected to or realized in external reality, and there's some kind of overlapping of internal and external states, is the sort of basic idea involved in objective chance. And I think that's important. It's not simply, when people talk about, often using the Jungian terminology of synchronicity, when they talk about synchronicities, synchronicities are often thought of as instances of meaning or as significance. But I think it's interesting that the surrealists emphasize the role of desire here, and that it's objective chance, at least in its most powerful sense, is when our desires are, in a sense, like directly realized in the outside world. Or I think perhaps for the surrealists especially, moments when an unconscious desire, a desire that we weren't even aware that we had, is realized in the outside world, and that these sorts of marvelous happenings in the world are as much a revelation of our own unconscious or our own internal desires that come about through these seeming chance occurrences. In Breton's writing about objective chance, I think you really see that tension that I mentioned at the beginning of this part of the video between seeing this as something that literally is just chance, and that it's only the fact that we have, certain types of desires or unconscious desires, that, sometimes there happens to be an intersection between those internal states and the outside world. Even if it strikes us as being powerful or meaningful, it simply does arise by chance. But then he's always really tempted, or you can see him beginning to set foot down this road of thinking that there's something more to it than that there's actually some other force or type of intelligence active that goes beyond his individual mind and his individual consciousness, that is actually in some way operating within the world and is somehow arranging or coordinating things in some mysterious fashion. So I think there's also that there's a sense of a quest here to uncover something that is potentially a deep mystery of the cosmos itself. But there's always that, I think, sort of uncertainty and openness to that, and also a really, I think, profound willingness to just be within that liminal space where you're never quite sure and it's never quite clear, and just embracing that, I think, is a powerful thing. All right, here's another quote from Andre Breton. This is another later writing. So he's referring here to perhaps my favorite book of Breton's, at least that I've read, a text called Arcane 17, which he wrote during World War II. The title of the book, Arcane 17, refers to the 17th arcanum, or the 17th Atu, trump number 17 of the tarot, which is the card, the star. And that card and the image on that card, and even some of its esoteric correspondences, like its Hebrew letter correspondence, are all form the kind of core image or anchor point around which the text kind of constantly branches off and circulates around and returns to. So that itself would be a great example of esotericism in Surrealist work. So an entire book that really centers around a single tarot card. Anyways, let's just read the quote here. So this is a later writing of Breton's. So he says, previously in Arcane 17, which I wrote in Canada, this is an address that he actually gave on a Canadian radio station. So he's emphasizing the fact that he wrote the text in Canada. Previously, in Arcane 17, which I wrote in Canada, I expressed the conviction that the process of artistic discovery is invested in the form and the means of the advancement of high magic. Today it is well established, we have proof of it, that esoteric thought has strongly attracted or influenced most of Surrealism's precursors, such as Hugo, Nerval, Bertrand, Fourier, Baudelaire, Lautréamont, Rimbaud, Mallarmé, Jarry, Roussel, Kafka. To the extent that Surrealism obeys historical determinations in passing through them, it is plain that it could not skirt the esoteric in its turn, that, even though confining itself to poetic ground, it would be led to verify certain fundamental esoteric theses. Surrealism long since had begun to have a presentiment of this. The important thing is that it should be assured of it from now on. So this the reference here to high magic is, I think, coming out of the tradition of Eliphas Lévy, the important French esoteric, mid-19th century esoteric writer, who was also one of the main sources for the Golden Dawn and for Aleister Crowley. Aleister Crowley, in fact, would claim that he was actually the rebirth of Eliphas Lévy. So he's, that term high magic, that's a term that Lévy uses. Now, the distinction between high and low magic is something that I think, especially in modern scholarship around the esoteric, has really been undermined. But, Breton is still thinking in the lines of that tradition. It's interesting to see him saying or exploring the idea here that that surrealism kind of couldn't help but explore the esoteric, that because of, even just at a purely literary or artistic level, because of the precursors and the tradition that it was part of, those things themselves were rooted in the esoteric tradition. It's not something that was like brought into surrealism from the outside, but that even perhaps unknown to them at the time that surrealism was being formulated, the esoteric was already there and already present sort of in its DNA, I suppose we could say, and that had to play out. Yeah. Anyways, let's just keep moving on here. All right, so now that we've started to get into the topic a little bit, I just wanted to make a few notes. This is certainly not a complete list or anything like that, but just a few sort of suggested notes about surrealism's use of or relationship to or interest in the various esoteric practices and traditions. So we see in all sorts of both surrealist writings, poetry, as well as in the arts, the visual arts, the imagery drawn from magic, from alchemy, from astrology, from practices of spiritualism and mediumship, from the tarot, from the Kabbalah. We also see employment of correspondences. This is probably, I think, most directly inherited from Baudelaire, who has a very famous poem on correspondences, which at some point we'll definitely do at least one video on the topic of correspondences, and we'll definitely look at that poem of Baudelaire's for sure, because it's an interesting translation of, or a linking between the sort of a poetic practice and that esoteric tradition, and became an important thing for a lot of like later 19th century, like the symbolists and some of those other French fin de siècle artists, and Surrealism is certainly continuing on in that tradition. The Surrealists have a sometimes complex relationship with correspondences as well. I think we'll talk about that on the next, when we get to the next image here. As you just mentioned, the idea of chance procedures as divination, and using those to uncover both the hidden dimensions of the individual as well of the external world, and that being one, I think, way of thinking about surreality, or that surreality includes, or the surreal includes what we ordinarily understand as external reality, with all of this kind of hidden or unconscious sort of content. The Surrealists, again, falling on 19th century and especially like romantic traditions of the artist, and especially probably the poet, of seeing the poet or the artist as a seer or a medium. Breton and some of the other Surrealists were actually quite interested in mediums as well, and often visited. There was I can't remember her name now, but there was a particular medium that Breton and some of the other Surrealists consulted on a number of occasions, and felt that she was able to give them really useful advice. So that's, I mean, certainly a place where that's not simply a poetic practice. I mean, Breton is genuinely receiving advice about life, from a psychic medium. Let's see. I think there was also a very romantic sort of notion of the magician or the sorcerer or the witch as a rebellious figure. Certainly rebellious against the Catholic Church, which was still quite dominant, and pervasive in France and Spain, throughout Europe, parts of Europe, or against Christianity more generally. And so there's something, there's a rebellious sense of the magician or the witch who is able to utilize these powers, outside of any kind of dogmatic structure or orthodoxy that I think is very enchanting to a lot of the Surrealists. As we've already mentioned before, language was certainly understood in magical terms, and in images as well. That's, image is in throughout the esoteric tradition, is you think of like the talismanic tradition, or even in a lot of modern kind of Golden Dawn influenced esoteric traditions, the role of visualization and visualizing particular images, or meditating on the tarot cards, for example. That image is invested with a magical power in a way not unrelated to the way that language is invested with that power. Art objects themselves were often again, sometimes more literally, sometimes in a more playful sort of sense, seen as talismans, or drawing on a lot of indigenous and non-European, non-Western practices as totems or fetishes. I think was a way of trying to reconnect the artistic practice to its deep magical roots, which I think resonates with some of the things that we looked at in the previous video when we talked about Alan Moore and his sense of magic as the origin of human culture. I think there's some definite resonances with his conception there and some of these surrealist practices. Let's see, transformation and specifically using alchemy or the sort of the language and imagery of alchemy to talk about transformation at any level, I think is important. That there's a sort of vocabulary of transformation that the alchemical tradition and alchemical imagery gives to the surrealists, and I think certainly transformation would absolutely be a key word for understanding all forms of surrealist practice, the mutation of images in automatic writing, or the very kind of wild, almost overwhelming transformations that various figures or objects or images undergo in surrealist painting or in surrealist filmmaking, and all of that, at least it more or less, at sometimes than others, is invested with this sort of alchemical significance or is understood through the lens of alchemy. I think the Surrealists also saw it, or at least some of them at times saw the practice of esotericism as reconnecting the sort of especially like Western white humanity to the roots to the full powers of the human, the things that they had been separated from, like in the dawning of modernity, and the extreme the turn towards a kind of very narrow sort of dominant form of rationalism, that these practices were restoring a kind of fullness to the human being. And as we mentioned, the Surrealists always drew a lot of inspiration from indigenous and non-Western traditions. Occasionally, they fall into romanticizing some of these traditions, but I think, especially for the time that they were working, they really deserve, I think, a lot of recognition for their deep respect for these traditions, and often seeing the sort of Europe and the West as fallen or broken in comparison with these other traditions that retained some connection to this, the sort of deep sources of human creativity and consciousness and everything else. As we've mentioned a few times in the previous video, the interest in the unification of opposites, or the dialectical practice, can, at times is happening more in a Marxist or a Hegelian sort of register, but is also similar to what we just said about transformation, is often given an alchemical significance, and images of the alchemical wedding or the union of the sun and the moon, sometimes the sort of sexual union of male and female, are all images or simply the combination of incompatible things, as we talked about with like the exquisite corpse or other such practices, were sometimes again invested with this kind of alchemical significance of the unity of opposites. And that's something we'll see several times more as we continue on here. And then finally, I think especially for certain surrealists in particular, like this will absolutely be true of Leonora Carrington, who we're not really going to talk about in this video, because we're going to do an entire video entirely devoted to her, which I believe will be the next video to follow after this one. Seeing the practice of art as a genuinely magical or spiritual practice, rather than taking elements of magic or spirituality like into art, but seeing art itself as a magical or spiritual activity. But at the same time, that there is this really profound engagement with the esoteric tradition. There are, as I've already tried to indicate, a number of points of contradiction and tension, and sometimes kind of struggle or even like anxiety that we can see in some of the surrealist authors regarding their attitude or their relationship to the esoteric. So again, not anything like a complete list here, just a few things I was thinking about as I was putting this together. First of all, you see, I see this especially in André Breton, the struggle between, on the one hand, the desire to enter into this magical, enchanted realm of experience, and seeing the transformative potential in understanding, the self and the world in this enchanted manner, but that being in tension with especially Breton's commitment to Marxism and the Marxist theory of historical materialism, and the understanding within any kind of orthodox form of Marxism that the only revolutionary attitude is a materialistic attitude, and that anything other than materialism is inherently counter-revolutionary, or is a sort of bourgeois mode of consciousness, or however else we want to say it. And I think that's something that Breton really struggles with. At its best, I think that struggle actually becomes a really important contribution to a certain unorthodox stream of Marxism, which I think still remains rather vital and can still be a source of potential and inspiration, where Orthodox Marxism seems to have really sort of lost that in the 21st century. Anyways, that's a topic for another time. I think if any of you are familiar with what's often referred to as Gothic Marxism, which is a term that I think goes back to, there's a book that was written in the 1990s by Margaret Cohen called Profane Illuminations. She basically uses that term Gothic Marxism to talk about a certain sort of unorthodox Marxism, and really traces it back to the writings of André Breton. Walter Benjamin, who we mentioned a couple times in the first part of this video, is a really important part of that story for her too. So yeah, I think that's a really interesting line of development out of that tension within Surrealism. Sometimes I think this one is a less productive, often a less productive or interesting sort of tension, but the Surrealist opposition to religion and to anything that smells of religion, I think is a point of struggle for some of them. That it feels, I think sometimes you get the sort of the sense that there's a worry that engaging in esoteric or spiritual topics is sort of smuggling religion sort of back into Surrealism, which it had much earlier rejected. I think there's also a kind of temporal sort of struggle or an understanding about history and the movement of history, and whether we need to continue moving forward with the sort of historical processes that are already underway. And yeah, I think there's maybe sometimes a worry or an anxiety about reconnecting to older forms, to esoteric forms and things like that drawn from older, previous centuries, there being a sense that that's somehow like regressive or even like conservative or reactionary. And they're certainly opposed to all forms of nostalgia. They're absolutely modernists in that sense, and interested in the new, and opposed to any attempts to sort of hold on to or even more so to return to an older form of culture and society. So again, the tension there is with their political commitments. But again, at its best, I think that tension leads towards some really interesting and productive results. Another thing that's really important for the Surrealists is that there's a denial, again, you see this especially in Andre Breton, a denial of anything separate or apart from the earth, certainly a denial of the afterlife, but they are also fairly hostile to the idea that there's a spirit world or some other realm out there, separate or apart from the material world. I think they're always interested in exploring the unconscious or the hidden dimensions within this world. That's a sort of complex topic that we maybe don't really have time to get into today, but I think it's just an important thing to be aware of. They're also, and this is another tricky thing to get a handle on, they're also really opposed to any form of mystification or obscurantism, that even though they're interested in the irrational or in these occult or esoteric sorts of phenomena that can't be understood, with anything like conventional reason or logic, any attempt to sort of mystery mongering or intentional obscuring or the sort of refusal to speak clearly, I think there's always often a very political suspicion towards that, and a rightful suspicion too. I mean, those things can absolutely be parts of certain types of right-wing or even sort of fascist political projects. Right. And so as I mentioned on the previous image about their practice of correspondences, there is a tension. This is an interesting, I think, thing to note about them, is that there's a tension between in traditional correspondences, you're reading if you look up tables of correspondence, they don't really love that because the correspondences are being given to you. They're sort of pre-selected and pre-made, whereas I think for a lot of them, they want to find new correspondences and to constantly, to use things like, automatic practices to uncover new forms of correspondence. So they're interested in the idea of correspondence, but they're often sort of hostile or at least uninterested in using traditional correspondences. We'll just keep moving on here. All right, so with all that sort of theoretical kind of preamble, I just wanted to take a look at some examples of esoteric art and a few more of the surrealists who engaged in esotericism. One of these is the painter Victor Brauner, who is a really under-recognized painter. He was really important for the Surrealists and for the development of Surrealist painting. He's also just a really, I think, fantastic painter, and it's I think striking that he's not very well known or recognized. So this picture here, while not openly esoteric, has a pretty famous story attached to it. So in the early 1930s, Brauner painted this self-portrait most famously, as well as a few other pictures that all included figures with damaged or removed eyes. This is Brauner's eyes at the time that he painted this picture were both sort of perfectly healthy, but he had this sort of recurring image, often of himself with a damaged or enucleated eye, which then became a reality several years later when he was intervening in a bar fight between Oscar Dominguez and another one of the Spanish surrealists, where a glass was thrown and accidentally hit Brauner in the eye, or a shard of glass hit Brauner in the eye, and he lost that eye. So I think it was very striking that an image that he had been painting for years suddenly later became a reality. So that was certainly an important example of, for them, the way that accessing the unconscious or images that arose out of the unconscious could be prophetic or precognitive in some fashion. All right, and then a few more paintings by Brauner that we can take a look at. Here we have what is maybe the greatest portrait ever done of Adolf Hitler. So this, I've never actually seen any statement, from Brauner of his sort of understandings or of what he was doing in this painting, or an interpretation of it from him. But I cannot help but think that he at least partially understood this as a magical act, that there is a genuine attempt to curse Hitler in some sort of way, in addition to just being an anti-fascist an anti-Nazi statement and a rather humorous image as well. I can't help but think that there's a genuine intention to affect Hitler or the Nazi regime through the use of a kind of image magic here. All right, and then here we get a couple of images of somewhat later paintings, both from 1947, where Brauner is directly incorporating and also modifying images from the tarot. So the Surrealists were deeply, as we've already mentioned, the Surrealists were deeply interested in tarot imagery. For them, this is always really primarily the Tarot de Marseille is their real main their focus. For Brauner, and I think for some of the others too, some of the continuing, the evolving French tradition of the esoteric interpretations of that tarot are important. And in particular in Brauner, you can see that he's drawing on the deck and the works of Oswald Wirth, who was a sort of successor to Eliphas Levi and Levi's esoteric and magical theories of the tarot. For anyone whose knowledge of tarot is coming out of the Thelema or the Golden Dawn tradition or any of the various tarots that have descended from those traditions, it's worth being aware that this French tradition uses an alternate set of correspondences between the tarot cards and the Hebrew alphabet. So in the card we see on the left here, this is very obviously a variation on the Magician card, which was called the Juggler in the Tarot de Marseille, but in the esoteric interpretation, this is the Magician. The Magician is attributed to the letter Aleph rather than to what might be more familiar to you, the letter Beth from the Golden Dawn tradition. The whole set of correspondences is understood quite differently, and for example, some of the planetary correspondences are not, what in the Golden Dawn tradition is known as the Yetziratic correspondences are understood quite differently in this tradition. So there can be a kind of cognitive dissonance when looking at some of these. If you're really deeply steeped in that Golden Dawn sort of traditions, you have to sort of learn to set all of that aside and understand that there is an alternate way of understanding those correspondences that is, I would definitely argue, is equally legitimate. So anyways, Brauner is using this French tradition of correspondences here, and we see the letter Aleph on the, I guess, hair or hat. The Magician is also often drawn with this sort of hat, but he depicts it in a we see another version of the Magician in the image on the right there, where it looks more like his hair. But in any case, we see the letter Aleph there, and this is something I think that Brauner is drawing from Oswald Wirth's tarot designs. The pose of the Magician, he's famously making that sort of as above, sort of so below gesture, but here his body is forming into the shape of the letter Aleph. And Aleph, among other things, suggests the creative power and the spirit, the creative spirit, also associated with the breath and so the word or the inception of speech. And so linking the Magician to the magical power of speech and language here as well. The card on the left, the Surrealist, is other than the sort of fanciful and strange table on which the Magician's tools are placed, a fairly straightforward depiction. We see, following Wirth and the esoteric interpretations of the tarot, rather than in the Tarot de Marseille, the juggler has a variety of different objects on the table in front of him. Here we see the elemental and suit correspondences here. So the Magician's holding the wand in his hand, and we see a sword and the cup and several coins on this strange, fanciful, surreal table that he's got there in front of him. But I think the more interesting painting to talk about here is the Lovers that we see on the right, which is he's using tarot imagery here, I think, in a really interesting and complex way. So the card is named after one of the cards of the tarot deck, the Lovers, but what we see in the deck is two other cards or variations on those cards. So on the left within this painting, we see the Magician, looking fairly similar, though dressed in a much more modern style to the Magician that we saw in the painting, the Surrealist. Although I just think actually perhaps in the painting, the Surrealist, the title of it is maybe the most interesting thing, that he's depicting the Magician of the tarot, but it's titled the Surrealist. So identifying the Magician of the tarot with or identifying the Surrealists with the Magician and equating those figures, and obviously making a kind of claim to the magical nature of the Surrealist project. So in the Lovers painting here, instead of the traditional image of the Lovers, we see instead the Magician and a variation on the High Priestess, or what in the Tarot de Marseille would be the Pape-S, or the Pope-S, drawing on this kind of heretical medieval folk tradition about Pope Joan, about this woman that manages to convince the Catholic hierarchy that, first of all, that she's a man and an ordained member of the clergy, and then somehow gets herself elected as pope. So this is kind of like blasphemous folk tale about a woman becoming pope, but that ends up as one of the tarot cards here, which is esoterically given the title of the High Priestess. Just like the Pope becomes the Hierophant. So anyways, there's a lot to say about this card. I think just that sort of substitution of seeing the Magician and the High Priestess as the Lovers, I think itself is already a really interesting move, and a kind of interesting interpretation of that and manipulation of that tarot imagery. Here, he is directly linking those two figures to the alchemical marriage of the solar and the lunar, or of sort of silver and gold, the red and white, all those the marriage of the red king and the white queen from Alchemy. So we see this in a few ways. The Magician's wand there has a solar disk on one end and a lunar crescent on the other end. And then we also see in this the priestess is sitting within a kind of low sort of triangular box there, that we see three papers or placards sort of attached to the box. So on the left, there we see, I'm not sure how clear you're going to be able to see it on your screen, but there are two magical sigils there, and these are the sigils that would be found in Agrippa's 3 books of occult philosophy, and in lots of other books that have come later, for the intelligence and the spirit of the sun. And then the sigils on the right-hand side of the box are the sigils of the intelligence of the moon. So you get these magical sigils for the occult powers attributed to those two planets. Now in the center, we see the number 1713, which is a direct reference to André Breton. And actually, if you kind of unfocus your eyes a little bit and look at the numbers, the numbers 1713, you can actually see that they're being drawn in such a way as they can actually be read as the letters A, B. You might have to look at it a second to be able to see it there, but they are actually this is something that Breton himself develops and takes the number this number 1713 as a kind of personal emblem that he derives a number of significances from that we're sort of not going to go into here. The important point is just that between the sigils of the sun and the moon, or the spiritual powers associated with the sun and the moon, we have a kind of coded reference to André Breton, which I think perhaps especially here, in the number 17 would also refer to the 17th Atu of the Tarot, and Breton's book Arcane 17, which he would have published just a few years prior to this painting being made, and Breton's interest and stated interest to or seeing surrealism as a quest for the unification of opposites, and a quote we'll see later on in this video of searching for the point from which all opposites descend, or in which opposites no longer are united and cease to be contraries. So another way of suggesting this sort of this mystical marriage of the sun and moon. A lot of other interesting things we could say here. The what do you call it? Lemniscate? Is that the word? The infinity symbol over the magician's head that we see in a lot of different decks. Here on this card has become a serpent, and we see, I think, 6 other serpents for 7 total, which obviously 7 is a critical magical number, the number of the classical planets. We see 7 serpents on the magician's torso and above his head. His hair here is becoming a kind of volcano, so a source of fiery, explosive, both creative and destructive power here. Interestingly, the high priestess, the bird head is obviously a very striking kind of surreal modification. We see her holding a book open on her lap, as she's typically depicted holding, but here the book is displaying the image of a pair of scissors, which I think the fact that the magician's wand shows the unification of the sun and moon, the fact that she's holding scissors, points towards division and separation, so that you almost get this higher level dialectic between them, not just of sun and moon, but also of unity and difference, or of like the alchemical processes of Solway and Coagula. Like she would be Solway, the dissolution, and then he's Coagula, the reforming. So they also get this kind of higher level dyad between them that I think is really suggestive, and also I think resonates with. The magician again has the letter Aleph above his head, the letter that he is, that card is attributed to in this tradition, and then above her head we see the letter Beth, which is the letter that the high priestess is attributed to in that French tradition. But the numerical values of those letters, the Aleph has the numerical value of 1, and Beth has the number of 2. So I think that her scissors and her division resonate with her that numerical value of 2, whereas he's 1. So again, you get sort of unity and duality. But in this marriage of sun and moon, it's not just the unification of the opposite things, but also like the unification of unity and difference, which suggests a very, I think, one of the most profound forms or understandings of the dialectical process here. So yeah, I just think that's a fascinating thing. And we also, this dialectical element here, I think is reinforced by some of the words that we see along the left and right sides of the painting here. So on the left, at the bottom, in French, of course, we see at the bottom the word for destiny, and then in the middle, magic, and then at the top, liberty. So suggesting, again, following this dialectical way of thinking, suggesting magic as the point of unification between the opposites of destiny and liberty. And then on the right-hand side, we have past at the bottom and future at the top, and then present in the middle, suggesting the present as the unification, or the point of the meeting point between the past and the future. And we can also have the correspondences across that, the past being linked to destiny, the future being linked to liberty, and then the present being linked to magic, which I think is a suggestive set of connections as well. So yeah, I think that's just a really profound example of using imagery, drawn from the tarot and other magical traditions, but using them not just to create a work of art, but even to really suggest a deep interpretation of these magical traditions, and something that we can actually sort of learn from or be inspired from, that he's actually encoding esoteric understanding directly in this work of art. Anyways, I don't know, there's more that we could say about this painting certainly, but we should probably just move along here. All right, and here we have the exact passage I was just referring to. I had forgotten what order. Originally, this had been later on in the set of images that I created, and I forgot that I had rearranged it to put it here. But yeah, here's the passage from Breton that I was just referring to. So let's see, we can just read it, and then I think it largely speaks for itself, but we can make a few comments perhaps. Let's see, so Bertrand writes, everything tends to make us believe that there exists a certain point of the mind at which life and death, the real and the imagined, past and future, which we just saw past and future in Browner's painting there, the communicable and the incommunicable, high and low, cease to be perceived as contradictions. Now, search as one may, one will never find any other motivating force in the activities of the Surrealists than the hope of finding and fixing this point. That's a pretty profound statement. I mean, Bertrand is certainly no stranger to hyperbole and sort of dramatic statements, but just the idea that this is at least at this moment, his understanding of the core project of Surrealism, I think is pretty striking. He continues, from this it becomes obvious how absurd it would be to define Surrealism solely as constructive or destructive. The point to which we are referring is a fortiori, that point where construction and destruction can no longer be brandished one against the other. And that resonates with some comments we made in the first part of this video about creation and destruction and their unity being a constant theme for the Surrealists. And this is a line of thought that goes sort of way back to Heraclitus, who we already referred to. And I think this passage, in addition to just being a powerful example of like alchemical and dialectical thinking and processes, I think also points to the really deep and profound aspiration of Surrealism, that this is extremely deep, sort of philosophical, even spiritual aspiration here. This is not, anything like just a kind of dabbling in occultism or anything like that, but the deepest and most profound human project here, and I just think that's worth appreciating. All right, and now we have a painting by the Surrealist artist Kurt Seligman. This is his the title of this painting is, of course, an esoteric reference to Baphomet, image developed by LFS Levy that I'm sure, or probably most people watching this video are obviously familiar with. If not, you can just do a quick image search for it, and you'll see. In a lot of Seligman's paintings, which, to be honest, I don't find Seligman the most compelling painter. He's certainly not one of my favorite among the Surrealists. In a number of his paintings, you'll get the title of a painting referring to an esoteric concept, but it can sometimes, I anyways find it difficult to see the link between the title and what's actually being depicted in the image. Here, there's a couple of the forms that we see are suggestive of the figure of Baphomet. The green figure there in the foreground appears to be making the as above, so below gesture that Baphomet is making in Eliphas Levy's design. Of course, that's also the gesture being made by the magician or the juggler in the tarot. The figure over towards the left there, the shape of the figure's head is sort of suggestive of the goat head and horns, perhaps, of Baphomet, or is maybe more generally just a kind of human animal or sort of monstrous sort of hybrid, which Baphomet also obviously is. But for our purposes, the real significance of Seligman is as a scholar of esotericism. Seligman, I think, was pretty unarguably the most learned of the Surrealists in the magical and occult traditions, and was often the sort of group expert on that topic. Especially throughout the sort of 1930s and 40s. He had a falling out with Breton that I've never really been clear. Apparently it was over the interpretation of a tarot card, but I've never really been clear sort of what that story was. And he was expelled, or I think Breton actually expelled him from Surrealism, which always seems one of the stranger expulsions, but I've never really gotten the whole story there. But I think he and his ideas and writings remained an important source. In particular, his book, The Mirror of Magic, History of Magic in the Western World, became a really important source for a lot of the Surrealists. It was published in 1948, so some of the later Surrealist investigations and a source of imagery. It's a really beautiful book. It was just republished within the last 5 or 6 years by Inner Traditions in a really nice. Actually, I think this is the cover from this new Inner Traditions edition, this collector's edition. It's a really nice hardcover that is a facsimile of Seligman's really elegant and nice designs and typography, and more than 200 like black and white illustrations there. So a really beautiful book, and a nice hardcover. And for a book on the history of magic published in 1948, I think it's quite good for its time. I mean, there are things here and there that are kind of outdated by like contemporary scholarly standards, but I think it's definitely ahead of its time, and definitely worth reading, and a beautiful book. And then we also have this quotation from Seligman, published right around the same from right around the same time that he was writing the book Mirror of Magic. So he says, though my interest in magic can hardly be brought into immediate relationship with my work as a painter, there is something about magic which fascinates me. It is not in vain that we speak of magical arts. Magic philosophy teaches us that the universe is one, that every phenomenon in the world of matter and of ideas obeys the one law which coordinates the all. Such doctrine sounds like a program for the painter. Is it not his task to shape into perfect unity within his canvas the variety of depicted forms, the presuppositions of high magic, all is contained in all, and all is one, are the basis of my forthcoming book. So, obviously really resonating with the things we've just said about the quote from Breton there, from the second manifesto, and Brauner's painting, and emphasizing that Seligman really understands magic in this profound philosophical and spiritual sense. All right, let's just look at a few more examples of esotericism in surrealist works. We can look at a couple of paintings by the really fantastic surrealist painter Wilfredo Lamb, who's absolutely one of my favorite painters. Lamb, I think, is interesting too for his cultural orientations. So Lamb is Cuban and grew up in Cuba. I think it was his godmother was a Santeria. I'm forgetting the term now in Santeria, but a Santeria priestess, and he was obviously just generally sort of immersed in that tradition. Also, a lot of real connections to Africa. I believe his father's side was Cuban. I don't know if his father was either first or second generation like Cuban Chinese, but his grandmother's side or his mother's side was African, and his grandmother was actually born in Africa, and obviously kidnapped and enslaved and taken to Cuba. So still a very living memory of African tradition there as well. He left Cuba as a young man and went to Europe to study painting. Initially, really influenced by Picasso, and a lot of his early works just look like Picasso, decent but still imitations of Picasso. Before he sort of switched teams, I guess, and went over to Surrealism and became a Surrealist painter. And then after fleeing France, after the Nazi invasion, he went back to Cuba and really reconnected to those sort of magical roots, magical and spiritual roots within the sort of Santeria and African diasporic tradition, and then incorporated elements of those traditions, into his surrealist art practice. And I think in a really interesting way, he was also learned in Western esoteric practices as well. And so, for example, in this painting here, we can see, there's a general just kind of ritual feel here. Even the title is obviously makes a reference to a kind of black magical ceremony, and we see knives and offerings and other sort of ritual implements, and some kind of demonic sort of looking figure there on the right. But we also see a magical square underneath the figure on the left there. And the figure on the left, this is one of probably the most common image in Lamb's paintings, is a kind of hybrid horse woman, which I think, among other things, is a reference to the concept in coming out of West African religion and in the diaspora of the priests and priestesses of the of the orishas, of the deities and spirits, when they are in that state of ecstatic possession by those deities. They are said to be ridden by those deities, and the images of a horse, that the priest or priestess is like a horse, and then the deity is the rider. So that image of a horse here is a very spiritually and magically charged image for Lamb. So yeah, we get a lot of these sort of woman-horse hybrids in his work, drawing on that African tradition. Right, and then another painting of Lamb's here. Again, quite suggestive of some sort of ceremony. And we see magical rituals, implements. Ceremony seems to be in progress here. We also see, in Lamb's paintings, there's also, I think, just a really striking kind of animistic, energy. Everything seems to be bursting with life. There's like faces and heads everywhere, as if, I don't know, sort of life or intelligence or magical power is just sort of resident everywhere in natural forms. In addition to the sort of woman-horse hybrids, we also see human-plant hybrids, animal-plant hybrids. I think really suggesting, to me anyways, this sort of this really kind of dynamic, animistic, enchanted sort of view of the world that is, I think, extremely resonant with the more main line of the Surrealist tradition. But I think, in a really compelling way, bringing in these African and African diasporic references as well. All right, here we have a painting from the great Chilean Surrealist painter Roberto Matta, who's often simply just known as Matta. Here we have the painting Disasters of Mysticism, obviously the title keying us in to the sort of esoteric or spiritual reference happening here in the painting. His paintings, which often feature vast spaces, very dynamic spaces, sometimes more abstract, sometimes containing more comprehensible figures, often with a very cosmic sort of feel. Matta is actually someone we will definitely return to in a future video series. He, along with a number of other surrealists that I'm quite interested in, were really influenced by the works of P.D. Ouspensky and some of the theories of the fourth spatial dimension. And I think you really see in Matta this kind of suggestion of hidden, dimensions of space or access to other sort of realms of either of space or of consciousness, and that sort of meeting of inner space and outer space, or of the the human mind, the human unconscious, the human imagination, and these vast sort of cosmic spaces. Or Matta was very influenced by like science fiction illustrations and science fiction imagery, so you get this sense of sort of other planets or foreign or other dimensions of existence. I think is a really powerful kind of conjunction of references in his work. Again, not necessarily visually similarly, but in some way suggestive of what we said about Lamb. You get, I think, a similar sort of sense of Matta of everything being saturated with this, roiling, both creative and destructive sort of energy, that everything is turbulent, and also forces in conflict or struggling against each other, but also constantly creative and productive, and that there are zones of entry for the human consciousness into other realms of existence or being or dimensions of knowing, or however you want to put it. Right. And then another painting of Matta's. This is The Earth is a Man, which obviously not meaning the male gender, but that that the Earth is a human, or that the Earth is a living being, perhaps with mind or soul. This could certainly be understood as a connected to the Hermetic concept of the microcosm and macrocosm. So we obviously see the Earth here receiving these descending rays from the sun there in the sort of upper left-hand quadrant. suggestion of cosmic space. We see various beings and forms on the earth, again suggesting this kind of productive dynamism and the sort of play of these various cosmic, creative, but also living animate forces, and a kind of mystical connection to these larger forms of intelligence or awareness, the sense that humans are within a greater realm that we obviously still have access to. All right, so just shifting gears a little bit, I wanted to look at an aspect of this surrealist relationship with esotericism that's not talked about quite as much, which is the interest and practice of astrology by André Breton and some of the other surrealists as well. So we've got here is an excerpt, and I've got another excerpt on the next screen from an interview that Breton did with an astrology magazine in 1954. So earlier in the interview, Breton says that he began studying and practicing astrology in 1927. So by 1954, that's about 27 years that he's been practicing astrology here, which I think is a striking fact on its own, just that he kept up the practice. At this point, he's kept up the practice for nearly 3 decades, and he did practice it quite intensively. I mean, there are stories of him writing up, readings of other people's birth charts that go on for, dozens of pages. This was not, a casual practice, but something he really, devoted himself to and put a lot of time and effort and serious attention into. All right, so the interviewers say, if we can talk of astrology as being considered as a lyrical game, would you go as far as describing astrology as the tool of an architecture of universal relationships? And then Breton says, not being a geometrician, even less so in the ancient sense of the term, I'm not qualified to talk about that. What I've always valued enormously in astrology is not so much the lyrical game to which it lends itself as the multi-layered logical game, which is a necessary part of it and on which it is founded. Quite apart from the very subtle means of evaluation that astrology uses and its predictive abilities, I consider its capacity for stretching and exercising the mind to be second to none. To unravel a destiny beginning with planetary placements, their aspects, their signs and houses, depending on the position of the ascendant in midheaven, this requires more than enough mental dexterity to silence any attempts at ridicule, and, compared with this sophistication, conventional logical reasoning comes out looking like child's play. So I think it's just worth noting here that Breton is directly acknowledging the predictive abilities of astrology. I think, this is interesting based on what we said earlier about Breton's own sort of struggle around, materialism and magical forces and how to orient in his political commitments and how to orient himself among those things. So yeah, I think it's just worth noting here, him directly acknowledging the predictive abilities of astrology. I have occasionally seen in the few kind of art historical accounts of Breton's practice of astrology that it was, simply a kind of game that he didn't really take seriously, or something like that. It was just a kind of, absurd, exercise in using an alternate form of knowledge that they didn't really take seriously. But I think you get this from this quotation and other things he says in the interview. That's clear that that's not the case, that he genuinely practices this and feels that it has, real predictive ability. This point about it stretching the mind, I think is quite interesting, especially in relation to the broader Surrealist project. I think that I think that's quite profound. Coming from someone who's made the Surrealist project the real center of his entire life. That he would see astrology as having that kind of power on the mind. Both for the sort of logical. The technical aspects of delineating a chart in all of its complexity, which I think is worth noting. Breton says elsewhere in the interview that he really feels that looking back to traditional forms of astrology is really important, and he's definitely rather suspicious of some modern forms of astrology, which tend to be quite simplified and to lose some of the sophistication of some of its earlier forms. And, I think he doesn't really quite say it explicitly, but I think you also get the sense that the kind of analogical thinking that's required for astrology, from moving between, these astrological symbols and the specifics of, what's read in a chart, and then making the link to, a person or the events that happen in someone's life. That type of thinking, I think, has an obvious relationship with the types of thinking or the types of logic that we see within, surrealist works of art and writings. All right, and then a little later in the interview, another excerpt from a little later in the interview. The interviewers say, "Is astrology solely a man-made creation, or is it a formulation of the universe, experienced by man?" And Breton answers, "Because it is exactly that, a brilliant formulation of relationships between man and the universe, this doesn't create a problem for me. Apart from foolish vanity on his part, man really ought to know that he does not create, that he is simply permitted to reveal a little of what is hidden, and to refrain from covering up again as much or more of what has already been revealed, and to free the latent energies within nature. Whether a person devotes himself to the discovery of Neptune or to that of penicillin, both seem to me to be fulfilling their part in the process of unveiling what is hidden." So I think this is really suggestive, not just for his understanding of astrology or the esoteric practices more generally, but even for a suggestion about the nature of creation as discovery, and that I think this idea of freeing the latent energies within nature, I think is a really interesting addition to what we've been saying about the surrealist account of creativity and the way that extends beyond, just a single individual. I think we talked about that more in the first part of this video. But here, directly linking that to the energies within nature, and that those latent energies are, what we discover. The creative power is not ours personally, but is something that we participate in, which I think definitely resonates with the sense that I get from, some painters like Roberto Matta, that we just looked at, of the artist trying to tap into a kind of creative power that is greater than the individual artist. We already, I think, talked about some of the social and collective, and even the kind of political sort of implications of that. But yeah, I think here we're getting this that extension of that idea into these sort of cosmic and transhuman sort of zones that I think is quite interesting and suggestive. Right, so I think we're at a good place to stop for the second part of the video. And something we'll actually pick back up looking again at automatism, and another form of automatism and its magical implications. And that will lead into a sort of sequence of connected ideas and images that will lead us into the finale of this whole video, and hopefully we'll link together some of the different threads and ideas that we've already been developing over the first two parts of the video here. So look out for part 3 in the next few days, and see you then. Bye.